Welcome. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Mariana Siciliano. I'm the managing educator for public programs here at the Met. Can you hear me? All right, how about that? A little better? A little better? Okay. Welcome. Thank you for being here to today's Curator Talk. We're very excited to take a closer look at the exhibition Emily Sargent, Portrait of a Family, which brings the artist's work into focus, situating it within the creative, complex world of the Sargent family. The exhibition is on view until this Sunday in Gallery 773, so absolutely be sure to see it if you have not yet done so. We'd also like to extend our thanks to the William P. Rayner Fund for making the exhibition possible. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Stephanie Herdrich is Alice Pratt Brown, Curator of American Painting and Drawing in the American Wing. Her work focuses primarily on late 19th century American paintings and drawings. In addition to curating Emily Sargent, Portrait of a Family, her recent exhibitions include Sargent in Paris and Winslow Homer, Cross Currents. She has contributed to exhibitions and publications about American Impressionism, American drawings, and artists Charles Hassam, George Caleb Bigham, Thomas Hart Benton, among others. She was a BA in art history from Washington University, St. Louis, and received a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie Herdrich.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again so much for coming out on this very dreary afternoon. Is there anything better than looking at luminous watercolors? I hope that for just a bit I can transport you. And of course, I hope that you have already seen or will take a moment to see the exhibition on the mezzanine of the American Wing, which Mariana has said closes on Sunday. It's been up since July 1st, and it's just been such a delight and a pleasure to introduce the world to Emily Sargent through her artwork, not through only through her famous brother. And we're really delighted. It's been a long run, but we're really delighted that over 100,000 people have seen the show, which for a kind of sort of modest little show tucked away in the not always easy corners of the Met to find, we're just really, really excited. And this show is really special to me. You may know and you've heard that I worked on the Sargent in Paris show, and John Singer Sargent has really been a lifelong pursuit of me and mine in my work. And I've always known about Emily, the younger sister of John, of course, but seeing her through the works and meeting her again through her art has just been a really special moment. Here she is in 1911, so she's born in 1857, so this is a bit later in her life. I think she's in Italy in that photo, but she was a talented watercolorist, born in Italy to American parents. She comes to watercolor late in life. She gets her first lessons and introduction as a young child, but then it's really in the 1890s when she's in her 30s that she embraces the technique. As she has more freedom to travel and explore, she uses it to capture, record, observe the world around her, and really experiments with the technique, develops a style with broad ways of using watercolor, mostly painting and landscape. So if you knew her before today or before this exhibition, you probably know her from works like this. This is a wonderful watercolor in the Met's collection in the Generalife, done by John Singer Sargent, which shows Emily at center, at her easel, painting in watercolor in the gardens of the Alhambra in Granada, Spain in 1912. And this is, aside from being an extraordinarily beautiful masterpiece by John Singer Sargent, which really shows the full range of his technique in the medium, it captures her life, the family life, how they lived, especially in the early 20th century, just perfectly. And that is a life that was often full of travel, exploration with family and friends, and really united around this love of making art and painting. So this idea of her painting on plein air, outdoors, enjoying a passion pursuit of hers with a friend, a very close family friend, Jane de Glenn, who's seen on the left, and another woman who somehow we know her name is Dolores Carmona, a Spanish friend about whom we know actually nothing except her name. But a fascinating work to me for many reasons, aside from what it shows, its beauty and technique. The fact that Sargent actually doesn't draw in his sister's face. If you look closely and go up to the show, the other two figures are very careful underdrawings in graphite, portrait studies, and Emily is just barely sketched in. I don't know why. He saw her all the time. Maybe he thought he'd finish it later, paint it more, or we could do some Freudian analysis of it, which I will not go into. But that said, it wouldn't be true, right? Because we also do know they had a very close relationship. They were separated in age by exactly a year. So they really were friends, companions, and united by a very interesting childhood, which I'll talk about in a minute. And here she is, later painting, I think this is in Tangier. At the right is her sister Violet. John Sargent and Emily Sargent had one younger sibling, Emily, who is born 14 years after John. So John and Emily are a year apart, and then Violet is much younger. So they are close, but not as close as John and Emily, and that is a nephew. So I just wanted to introduce a few of her works here early on. Just to give you an idea of the kind of subjects she paints, these architectural studies. She's going to wonderful places, to Egypt, throughout the Middle East, around the Mediterranean, Switzerland, Corfu, visiting amazing, amazing spots, Venice, of course. And a lot of these places are places she went with her brother, places that her brother also painted. So, as I said, mostly landscape, architectural, very few figures, usually just anecdotal. But we see her just trying and learning constantly. And her work has such great variety. So from what we just saw, those architectural studies, to this, I think, which is one of my favorites, this almost abstract autumn landscape where she is painting this beautiful foliage, the abstraction of behind, and using more advanced watercolor techniques, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or this incredibly subtle and sophisticated watercolor done with very delicate washes of pigment, a quite, sensitive technique. So the contrast and the range, and I kind of love that she's just always trying new things and letting her personality show. I suspect and hope that we have some watercolorists in the crowd. Anybody? A few, yes. So you all know watercolor is a very difficult medium, right? The pigment soaks into the paper. It's harder to hide your mistakes. It's very fluid. It allows for a lot of experimentation. It's very transportable, which is one of the things that makes it wonderful for all the traveling she did. And it also really captures very well light, reflection, water because of its transparency. So it's well suited for the types of subjects that she becomes attracted to. This show is inspired by a gift of 27 watercolors by Emily Sargent to the Met, which happened in 2021. What is happening in these photos? Basically, we knew she painted, of course. We have all these images and photos of her painting, but we didn't know her works. Where were they? They were in a trunk in some relative's attic or basement, almost 400 of them. So she produced a very significant body of work in watercolor, which of course she had given to family and friends here and there. She exhibited only a few times in her lifetime, but they had largely not been seen for almost 100 years. Neither she nor John Singer Sargent have children. Their sister Violet did have children, and so the artworks descended through that part of the family. So in 2022, I think it was, it was 2021, I was invited to see and go through all of the watercolors in London. And so what you're seeing on the left is a stack of the watercolors in the kitchen of one of Sargent's descendants, and they were just piled everywhere. He had put a board on the burner of the stove to make more counter space, and we spent one day leafing through all of them. And this is not a great photo. I'm sorry, I didn't have the foresight to take better ones, but I wanted to show you, can you see my pointer? See, these are they were stored in these boxes, and we were kind of going through these boxes and flipping through them, and we'll come back to this. And here's another one of these stacks. You can see them all under here, and these, spoiler alert, these are 2 that I chose. And we'll talk more about how I made the selections as we go through, because our collection of works by John Singer Sargent, which is quite vast, we have about 300 watercolors and drawings by John Singer Sargent, which also came mostly from the family. And then this new gift. So I really wanted to find correspondences between Emily's work and the collection, and there were quite a few. So here's just a little shot of the show. If you haven't been to the mezzanine of the American Wing, this loose corridor. This is the last exhibition in that space. It is about to become an exhibition of American guitars, which will be really, really exciting. But for now, we have this one little Emily Sargent display. But I would say that the show it's not big. It's about 35 works of art, almost half and half even between John and Emily, and then a few guest appearances by other family members. But it has 3 small sections, one where we just focus on Emily's work, one that I tell the story of the Sargent family through John Singer Sargent's works, and then a 3rd section which places their works side by side in dialogue. So just kind of run through some of these examples. But I did want to talk about the family history and background because it's such an interesting one. You see the mother, Mary Newbold Sargent, on the left, Fitzwilliam Sargent on the right. She was from a Philadelphia family. He's from Gloucester, Massachusetts. He is a surgeon living and working in Philadelphia when they marry and meet. Their first child is born in 1852 and really sadly dies at 2 years old, just in 1854. And they decide to travel to Europe. And their reasoning is to recover from this terrible tragedy, health reasons. They're going to Switzerland to find a moderate climate, take some waters. They never return to the United States, and they lead an existence in Europe sustained by income from Mary Newbold Sargent's family, an annuity she inherits from her father mostly, and by taking advantage of favorable exchange rates in the period and moving frequently and living often in places off-season. So seeking spots where the tourists are not, and that's when they live there. Here we see on the left a little portrait sketch of Fitzwilliam by John Singer Sargent, 1870. Sargent was 14 years old. So he is learning to draw at an early age, and the family is saving all of these early works. Fitzwilliam Sargent, as I said, was a surgeon, but he authored, illustrated, and published a book on bandaging I think first published in 1855, reprinted multiple times, and actually apparently used throughout the Civil War as a very important manual. You see here a few pages that I selected with his illustrations. He also is an astute observer and recorder of the world. I picked the page in the center as one of the pages that's shown in the exhibition because I love the combination of this sort of, like a little neoclassical settee to enhance the scene of, the patient's traction. But this, and the bust on the right, who's getting his head bandages, also looks almost like a Roman emperor to me. This is a family that's really studying art, interested in classical art, and incorporating it. A fun fact is that I bought this book on the internet for the show. You never know what you can find, but I'd seen digital copies of it, and I just thought how amazing to also think about how Sargent's parents inform his view of the world and his way of recording it. Because we often talk a ton about his mother and his mother's influence. And I'm not just on John, but on both of them. And I'm so sorry, we had a problem. This slide, we don't know why it's gotten so faded out. You'll have to go up to the show or look on the website. It's Sargent's drawing of his mother, also from 1870, here done in the Swiss Alps. And she's always was a guiding force in the life of her children. She was an amateur watercolorist who encouraged her children to paint and sketch daily. And there was a rule, apparently, if you started a sketch, you had to finish at least one each day. So imagine that kind of training of eye and hand from a very young age. We're talking 6, 7, 8 years old. By the time he's 14, he's filling entire sketchbooks. But she wasn't just encouraging John to sketch, right? All of her children were sketching. And Emily was right there sketching beside him. Do they save her works? Was she producing as much? No. We don't know how much she drew as a child, and we don't have any of her juvenilia. This is Mary Newbold's work in watercolor. This is quite a late work. This sketchbook is from 1904. She was 78 years old when she traveled with Emily on a cruise throughout the Mediterranean, a very many month-long cruise. And she fills this sketchbook with scenes of the coast from the boat, lots of linear pencil drawings, and then this really remarkable watercolor where she's worked it up, recorded detail, with quite a lot of observation. We have a wonderful reminiscence of Mary Newbold Sargent from a dear family friend, the author who became known as Vernon Lee, and she's about the same age as John and Emily, and they are children together in Italy. And she talked about her memory of Mary Sargent. She writes, Mary Sargent was constantly painting away, always an open paint box in front of her, her whole jocund personality splashed, as it were, with the indigo of seas and the carmine of sunsets. And so I love this like sort of embedded memory from her childhood of Mary always sketching and painting. And then this wonderful sketchbook, which came to the Met as part of a gift in 1950 from Sargent's estate. And this just has been, confessing this is the first time we've ever shown it. So just been a wonderful opportunity to get more of these works out of storage. To speak more about their childhood, this constant movement, travel, seasonally, and sketching, this wonderful photo of John and Emily from the late 1860s. And this is an image of one of the sculpture galleries at the Vatican. So not only did Mary encourage her children to sketch and draw, but she made sure that they saw every museum, every monument, every picturesque site as they traveled throughout Europe. And we have another wonderful description from Vernon Lee of one of these outings to the Vatican Sculpture Gallery. So it was the parents, probably the two mothers, and then Vernon Lee, her name was Violet Paget when she was a child, and John and Emily Sargent, who would have been at this time 10, 11 years old. And this is her memory of these outings. She writes, there were scamperings barely restrained by responsible elders through icy miles of Vatican galleries to make hurried, forbidden sketches of statues selected for easy portrayal. So you'll have to imagine Emily and Violet sketching, but we do, of course, have a few of these early sketches by John, done in the Vatican galleries, the famed Belvedere torso, the Laocoon. He's not choosing sculptures for easy portrayal. He is choosing the great masterpieces of antiquity already at this early age, looking at the great art, thinking about training and developing his artistic skills. You are probably familiar with his story, which is that around this time, they determine he has a great desire to be an artist, and they start channeling all their resources into him, becoming a painter. And he starts having some lessons. In 1870, he takes a month-long walking tour with his father in the Alps, where he's painting figural studies, landscapes, again. I don't know what you were doing when you were 14, but none of us were probably painting like this. Really cultivating his skill and talent. This is another, you see the landscape again. I love this little drawing from the sketchbook. We don't know who that is. I don't think it's Emily. I wish it was. But the contrast here being, young John Singer Sargent is doing manly outdoor hiking, strengthening his, fortitude, getting fresh air. And Emily and the women of the family were left at Interlaken, where they sketched and looked at the landscape. And we'll talk a little bit more about Emily's health in a minute. The rest is sort of history for John Singer Sargent. Many of you probably saw Sargent in Paris, so he goes to Paris. He, inserts himself in that world and becomes the great portraitist of the late 19th and early 20th century. Yeah. You know all these works, right? Up in the galleries. And I want to, of course, focus on Emily, really sweet Emily. So I think a defining quality or aspect of her childhood is really a quite tragic story, which we don't have. Family legend sort of history says that as a toddler, she was dropped by her nanny and suffered a very bad back injury that they didn't know how to treat, which I think is extra sad because the father was a surgeon and a physician. But how they treated this injury was by immobilizing her for almost 2 years, where she was put on a backboard, and you see her here reclining in this really just intense, amazing photo. Her father was devoted to her and her care, but they did not pick the right course. Eventually, they travel to London, they get more medical advice, and basically tell them this treatment has been harming her, and she is released from the confines of this backboard and has whatever late 19th century physical therapy looks like, relearns to walk. But in the family, there is, an extra precious quality to her. They are very sad, very concerned, and there's an idea, which turns out to not be so true ultimately, that she's very frail, that she can't always go on the hike, she can't participate. But we know how this story ends up, right? Which is she becomes quite healthy, robust, and it does not stop her from spending 2/3 of her life traveling extensively and painting and kind of embracing life. And she has some illnesses along the way where they also think she gets some kind of virus or flu. I mean, it's very, very sad, and the family writes of her stoicism and her sweetness. But she does overcome this. She does have lifelong back problems, which people said, she was very sensitive to. But as I said, really goes on and has a really wonderful experiences. You see her here in a photo from the early 1880s, and then of course a portrait by her brother when she would have been just 21 years old, a quite elegant portrait. One more word about the family before we move on is here we have 2 images of Violet, the much younger sibling, so this pencil drawing by Sargent on the left, and this really interesting painted sketch, Violet on the left there in the black dress. These are both works that came to the Met from the artist's estate in 1950. A lot of that material was really the remains of the estate, stuff they didn't want to give away, works they thought weren't quite finished, personal things, right? Images of some family members. And both of these works were in that collection. And I point out the work on the right from 1889. Violet is wearing a black dress in mourning for her father. John Singer Sargent, ever playful and interested in composition, I think has the 2 figures swap hats just for some maybe pictorial interest. I don't know, but the family is, of course, very upset by this. Fitzwilliam Sargent had been in poor health for some time, and Emily is really devoted to caring for him in his final years. And it's really after his death that she then starts painting in watercolor and traveling. So the freedom of, the sadness of his passing corresponds with a little more freedom for her to travel. I said that she starts painting as a child, learning to paint and sketch, but as an adult, she is definitely learning a lot from John and painting alongside of him. And I just have a couple of, on the left, you see them together around 1907 in northern Italy, and then a later photo, that we already saw that photo, sorry. This becomes this really lifelong habit. They're very close, and they are he is teaching her, he's inspiring her, but I would argue that she probably is also inspiring him. And so in her work, we see this is a park garden, we think in Italy. To me, this work, probably unfinished, if you notice that this garden ornament is not kind of finished, outlined. And we can all have a discussion about finished and non-finished, but to me, this really feels almost like an artistic experiment and exercise in green, in creating these forms, these volumes of the manicured trees with these different shades of green and that bright, bright sunlight. There has been suggestions that this was painted at Villa Marlia in Lucca. You see here an example also thought to be painted at Villa Marlia in Lucca from the MFA Boston's collection. So I will say that when the descendants distributed the Emily Sargent works, they gave some to the MFA Boston, to the National Gallery, to the Tate in London. So they've kind of spread them out. And it's been wonderful to kind of talk to my colleagues there and compare the works as we're learning about Emily. This, a view of Spain, we think Avila, where she's taking a broad view and again practicing this the layering of the washes and capturing the space and perspective and distance. And then the boldness of something like this, probably done at Lake Garda or somewhere in the Italian lakes, where it's all about the reflection of the building and the light on the water, painted very, very with great expression, and again, kind of becoming abstract. Or this done in Corfu, about the light and shadow on that whitewashed wall. Now, I said she's often painting and traveling with her brother, and here you see an example of his work, Corfu, Light and Shadows from the MFA Boston. Similar interests, similar goals, but completely different outcomes and experimentation. But you could also see how a series like this inspires one of these works that we saw earlier, right, with the layering of colors, the building in the background. And here she's using a more advanced technique, using a wax resist, where layering colors using a wax crayon and then painting over it so that the color doesn't soak into that part. I liken it to if you ever dye Easter eggs and take a crayon and draw on the Easter egg and then dip it in, the color doesn't stick there. This is the kind of advanced technique she's experimenting with. And you have to remember, of course, the challenge, how you have to plan a composition if you're layering colors like that, right? And the way that watercolor could become very, very muddy as you layer wet washes over each other. But here, the kind of planning that this takes in the layers is becoming quite sophisticated. And when we talk about her, we refer to her as an amateur because she has very little formal training, but also because she never exhibited or sold her art, or rarely exhibited it. And there's one moment in her life where she does exhibit her art, and in the 1890s, and she exhibits a handful of copies after the old masters. So not surprisingly, like her brother, like many of artists of the era, she's really intensely interested in the great art of the past and learning from the old masters. You see her here late in life, not too long before her death, doing a copy at the National Gallery in London. But here is an example of the kind of works that she exhibited, this copy after Franz Hals. And not surprisingly also, she's looking and admiring the same artists that her brother is admiring. Sargent was a huge fan of Hals, and I wouldn't be surprised if they discussed it, looked at Hals together, or he recommended she look at his work as well. So in the third and final section of the exhibition, this is the part where I put their works together. And in planning the exhibition, I was intensely aware that I was really introducing Emily's work to a large audience. And I didn't want her to suffer in comparison to her brother, who has a reputation as being one of the greatest watercolors of all time, and certainly of the 19th century. But I think that their relationship is so important. The similarities and the differences in their work really illuminate a lot about both of their artistic practices. And so I just went for it. And there, I think, some really interesting comparisons. So when I was flipping through these works of art in the kitchen of our donor, and I saw this work by Emily, I immediately knew that I had to have it. This is a really interesting watercolor done in the early 1890s, so very early in her watercolor journey as an adult, where she really creates this carefully studied architectural courtyard. It is inscribed Cairo. We know she was there in the early 1890s and then again later in the early 1900s. But based on her style and technique and what we call sort of the tightness of it, we really thought it was from the early 1890s. But why I knew I really wanted it for the Met's collection was because we have this watercolor by John Singer Sargent. The exact same vantage point, the same scene. And this has been one of the kind of fun puzzles of this. we cataloged our Sargent drawings in the late 20th century, or also known as the 1990s. And, we didn't know what this was, where this was. We thought, oh, it could be Egypt, it could be Turkey. We were really thinking of the places he went and painted, but we didn't know where it was. And we did think it was the early 1890s. But when you put them side by side, I just think it's amazing to be able to compare them. And I have posed all kinds of questions to Sargent scholars, like, do we think that they were there together? It certainly seems like it. The color palette is very similar. The pages are slightly different sizes. But is it possible that Emily could have been copying one of Sargent's watercolors to learn? I don't think so. I don't think so. But we can also just go back and forth and look at the details, how they paint them, the tendency to sort of abstraction in the Sargent. I always wondered, like, are these figures here? And then you look over here and you're like, oh, they're definitely figures, right? These correspondences, and they kind of illuminate each other. So I gave a little gallery talk to some staff and our fellows here the other day, and there was a fellow from Egypt who was like, oh, that's definitely Cairo. I'm pretty sure I know where that is. So it's wonderful in this case that Emily's inscription matched what was on the watercolor, because I'll talk about how that's not always the case, but then that we can now identify with much more certainty that this is Cairo and Sargent was there in 1891. So being able to compare and study them together has been really wonderful. And then I'm showing you, this is not a very good quality, a slide on the right, Bazaar in Cairo from the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and to kind of compare these two, certainly done on the same trip. And this looks even more like the market that this colleague suggested. Then I couldn't find an exact picture of the place on the left, but this really is exactly like this market in Cairo, which still exists in part. So this is just to say, and we'll talk more about this, until I am able to travel to all of these places, which would be amazing, although obviously not right now, it's wonderful to crowdsource this research. When you are interested in Sargent and join a Sargent community, people are passionate about the Sargents and their painting, and I get messages from people, from scholars, from artists saying, I think he painted this here, and sharing information. So it's really a wonderful journey. So here, does anyone feel like they could tell the difference between Emily and John? This is painted at the Simplon Pass in 1910. I will help you to tell you that John Singer Sargent painted this oil painting, a waterfall, in 1910. You see the composition very, very exact, similar between the three of them. Does it help us identify who did what? Could we guess? Do you feel confident? The palettes are so interesting, the correspondences, how each artist works out details. I'll give away the answer here. The Emily is on the left and the John is on the right. But I think the conversation between these works, the difference in the palettes, Emily sort of takes it further and kind of closer to the painting and with the purples. And I hope you'll go see the show and look at kind of this central passage here, which is much more beautiful in person with these amazing layers of browns and purples that create a really, really stunning effect. And this is also from the MFA Boston, a wonderful watercolor of Emily at the Simplon Pass. I don't think she's painting that exact watercolor, but gives you another more idea of, again, how these holidays were for the family. These were summer-long painting holidays. These are a niece and a nephew who often modeled for Sargent in his paintings, but I just love the ambiance of this painting, the camaraderie, and the real kind of what we know of these holidays were quite wonderful, jovial experiences. There's a funny family anecdote that always says, there'd be like 10 or 12 or up to 20 of family members, and they'd join for breakfast, and the children always said they tried to hurry in and out of breakfast and really tried hard not to catch the artist, the painter's eyes, because they knew that would mean they'd have to pose all day. And then here's another example that I pair together in the show, which I think is quite interesting. The color here is not so great, as accurate, because I think in real life, the palette is very, very distinctive and similar with these green tones. And these are watercolors about the garden environment, the lushness, but also the idea of light and shadow on the architectural elements and the decor of the garden. So the work on the left is labeled The Alhambra, 1903, and the Sargent from a different part of Spain at the same time. And another crowdsourcing moment when I received an email from a watercolorist. Who is she here today? Oh, yes, this is Wenny Wong, who emailed me, a passionate artist and Sargent fan. And she said, I know where this is, and it's not the Alhambra. It is Florence, Italy, at the Villa Corsini. And how she identified this is from this John Singer Sargent watercolor in a private collection, which seems to be this same fountain, with a famous fountain with a horse head. I pulled this photo of it, not a very good quality, from the Sargent Catalogue Raisonné. And this is a photograph that may have been taken by Sargent himself. So you see the fountain and that kind of urn behind it, which I think is also sort of what you're seeing here. In later photos, it looks a little different, but you see, it's kind of a little bit hard to tell. And I haven't even had time to change or edit the labels yet. But again, crowdsourcing, amazing, and let's all go to Italy. I can't paint, but I'll carry the brushes. And then another very popular destination for the family holidays was a little town in northern Italy called Pratt in the Val d'Aosta, which is there sort of on the border of France and Switzerland. And they returned in this large group for several years, 1905, 1909, through 1909. And Sargent really focused his work there around this little brook that ran through this very picturesque town. And he paints it, again, as kind of study of light and shadow, the transparency, the reflective qualities of water, and using his paint. So this is another one of those works that came from the estate, probably not exhibited in his lifetime, but kind of experimental. Sargent uses that brook as a setting for a whole series of paintings, sometimes just posing family members in their normal clothes, but then these kind of imaginary, exotic pictures, sort of almost harem scenes. And then, of course, he also paints it in watercolor. Focusing on the same subjects. And he does this over and over again. We have quite a series. Here is Emily painting this brook at Pratt. A completely, you can tell it's the same site, I would say, but a kind of completely different effect, a brushstroke, palette. But if I show you this, if you haven't seen the show, do you know who did this? Anybody who hasn't seen the show? This is by both of them together. This is another one that when I saw it, I actually had to really beg for this. Because I said, we have these wonderful examples of Sargent's work at the Brook, but to think of them working on a sheet together, there's an inscription on the back of this one. The MFA also has a watercolor that they painted jointly, and the inscription on the back of that one in Emily's hand says, "John also painted on this." Which I think is really funny, and we'll have to read more into that. But I love the collaboration of this, that they're working on this together, that it becomes its own unique thing in style and technique that represents both of them, and I think that's quite magical. There is so much more to learn about Emily, and so at this moment, I really wanted to get her works out, to share them with all of you, so that painters and researchers and travelers and explorers could enjoy them, learn from them, teach me about them. I didn't want them to languish longer in storage until I had time to do all the research. So we've got mistakes in our labels. We don't know where all of these things are painted, but it was really important to introduce. And I wanted the show, it overlapped just about a month and a little more than a month with the Sargent in Paris show. So I really wanted them to at least kind of share the stage for a moment. as I wind down, just a few more pictures of them together, early in life and late in life, and this is their tombstone. John Singer Sargent dies in 1926. Emily dies a decade later, and you probably can't read this, but they are buried with the same headstone, John Singer Sargent and his sister Emily Sargent. So together, close in life and in death. But end, of course, with her work and foregrounding her, this beautiful photo of her painting in Tangier with her umbrella, and then another one of these beautiful, I think it's Tunisia, sorry. Another one of these really delicate, sensitive watercolors that she does, especially late in life. And yes, again, please take one last look at the show. I'm so grateful for your interest and your attention, and email me if you discover a location.